Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Da-eun. North Korea's sanctions violations are becoming bolder as it cements closer ties with its old friend Russia, which recently voted to disband a UN expert panel tasked with monitoring Pyongyang's illegal activities. Petroleum and foreign missile components are reportedly continuing to flow into the rogue state, heightening security risks on the Korean peninsula and beyond. Meanwhile, hopes are brewing that South Korea and China will mend soured ties as the two countries speed up steps to resume high-level dialogue that has been stalled for years. For an in-depth analysis on the latest security issues surrounding the two Koreas, we have our regular commentator, Dr. Go Myong-hyun, joining us in the studio. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
And to my left, we have Shreyas Reddy, correspondent at NK News Seoul. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's kick things off with you, Dr. Go. A sanctioned North Korean oil tanker has been spotted in waters off of China, which is believed to have stopped by Russia. In this, while Australia accused a Chinese fighter jet of dropping flares dangerously close to an Australian helicopter on a UN mission to watch over North Korea's illegal maritime activities. What do you make of all these developments?
Well, now that China and Russia have essentially dismantled the UN panel of experts that was tasked with surveilling and making sure that the sanctions that the United Nations Security Council, of which China and Russia are member of, had passed in the last 10 years to be implemented fully. I think North Koreans, along with the Chinese and Russian collaborators, they no longer have to watch out for the international community's watchful gaze. So therefore, they are essentially normalizing this kind of sanctions evasion activities. And so, for instance, the Ansan 1, this is the oil tanker that was sanctioned by the United Nations back in 2018, in fact, switched on its a positioning device called AIS near the Chinese territorial waters as well as in Russia. It's a signal to the wider community that, or international community, that North Korea was no longer caring about what the international community thinks, because this tanker has been sanctioned. It's in the list of a sanctioned vessel for a very long time. So any member state, including China and Russia, have to do their due diligence in making sure that this North Korean flag tanker doesn't violate the UN sanctions, in this case, buying or loading or unloading petroleum products. But clearly, that's not happening. And then the North Koreans then realized that they no longer have to hide the tracks anymore. So, in fact, what happened, the threatening behavior by the Chinese Air Force jet fighter against the Australian helicopter that wasn't part of this operation to make sure that the United Nations Security Council resolution was implemented in East China Sea. And apparently, this Chinese jet fighter launched flare, not actual missiles, a flare to threaten this Australian military helicopter to fly away from, and then also dissuade this Australian chopper from carrying out its mission, shows that the Chinese are essentially engaged in very active measures to protect not the United Nations activities, but in fact protect North Korea's illicit behavior. So if North Korea enjoys this kind of protection from China, then I think, in fact, it actually really spells the end of the United Nations sanctions regime against North Korea.
Well, the fact that North Korea's oil tanker that has been sanctioned for such a long time is moving around freely in closely watched areas, and also the fact that, as you mentioned, North Korea is normalizing sanctions violations, is, I think, that carry serious implications. Now, Shreyas, some experts say that the winner of Russia-Ukraine war is North Korea. According to the BBC experts in Europe, they retrieved what's believed to be North Korean missiles from Ukraine, and they were stunned at how North Korea was able to dodge all sanctions and assemble the foreign components at a remarkable speed. What are your thoughts on North Korea becoming a major missile supplier for more countries?
Well, it is definitely a big concern, and I think obviously we were talking about sanctions. Yes, sanctions prohibit North Korea from exporting missiles and other weapons, but let's not forget, for a long time, North Korea has been exporting weapons to lots of countries, has been doing it for decades. And so in that sense, it's perhaps not a new pattern for them, even if in recent years those sanctions have made it difficult. And at the moment, we see in terms of their cooperation with Russia, we've got two countries that are more than willing to flout international sanctions as they strengthen cooperation. And for Russia, in Russia, they have a very willing buyer for the war in Ukraine. But even beyond Russia, I think it's one of those things where seeing these weapons in Ukraine, there are much bigger implications. When it comes for North Korea, they're not just getting money out of selling this to Russia, they're also effectively seeing their newest missiles battle-tested in Ukraine. These are missiles that essentially were mostly developed after sanctions, and so they have all we've really seen them in the past has been their tests in and around the Korean peninsula. But now we're seeing them launched, and the Ukrainian forces have constantly denigrated these, say they mostly fail. But at the end of the day, for Russia, they're cheap missiles that hit they can still cause damage with it. For North Korea, they're still able to produce these missiles cheaply and in large quantities. And as far as they're concerned, they're getting valuable data out of it, as well as showcasing other potential buyers in an increasingly politicized world, polarized world, other people who may want to align themselves along the front with Russia, with North Korea, what their missiles can do, what damage they can do. And frankly, we've seen that sanctions could perhaps slow down North Korea's development, could hamper them a little bit, but it won't stop them. They've, as seen with these missiles, when the leadership wants to prioritize a particular goal, in this case, arms development and arms sales, they will do it. They will reallocate the resources. They will find a way.
I think you've pointed out a very good point there, that North Korea will never, ever give up its nuclear and missile programs, no matter what. And the missiles, if they're good enough for Russia, they're also good enough for other countries, right? Yeah. So I think Russia is setting a very dangerous precedent. And also, as you mentioned, the fact that North Korea is able to test their missiles in actual battlefield is all the more concerning. Another concerning news, North Korea conducted an unannounced liquid propellant rocket engine test in its Seoul satellite launch site. What are you reading into this?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, North Korea didn't announce this, so they obviously haven't given us details of what was there. But thanks to satellite imagery, we've been able to see evidence of activity there from the vertical engine test stand at Seoul. In terms of there's been areas under the stand have shown some signs of burn-off, effectively, which happens under intense heat, maybe chemical elements involved. And the significance of the vertical engine test stand is that it is used essentially for liquid fuel projectiles, as you mentioned, which could be for things like the space program. And Seoul is very much at the heart of North Korea's space launches, as opposed to the horizontal engine test stand, which they built last year, which is used more for solid fuel engines. Now, North Korea obviously hasn't said anything, and we haven't seen any clear-cut signs that, yes, a space launch is going ahead. We just know at some point North Korea intends to push ahead with its space launch plans. They've been saying it for a while. But seeing the vertical engine test stand being used to conduct testing activity ahead of, well, in the midst of all these rumors at North Korea's main spaceport, does remind us that another satellite launch, as well as potentially other launches, could be around the horizon. North Korea has been increasingly investing in Seoul, diversifying the range of facilities like that horizontal engine test stand, other launch pads. And so we could see a satellite launch on the horizon soon, but we could also see other technologies that could use these kinds of projectiles.
And amid concerns, rising concerns over North Korea's missile and rocket launches, Dr. Go, South Korea and the U.S. have launched a joint task force to more actively prevent North Korea's financing of its nuclear and missiles, and this with a particular focus on countering the North's ability to procure petroleum. What are some possible ways to tighten the screw on that front? And do you expect a fresh round of sanctions from Seoul Seoul and Washington on North Korea as well as Russia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so there's not much of a new innovation to take place in this area. I mean, the international community, through the United Nations, has been doing this for a very long time. We have to remember that the first sanctions on North Korea regarding the limiting North Korea's procurement of petroleum products dates back to 2017. It's been 7 years. So a lot of mechanisms are currently in place. So for instance, the incident involving the Australian helicopter and the Chinese jet fighter is in fact a part of the operation that the Australian Navy carries out regularly to enforce sanctions in East China Sea. So, but then if you want to expand that further, there are two different ways the South Korea and the United States can collaborate together to tighten the noose, so to speak, around the North Korea's illicit activities. One is clearly going after the physical manifestation of these procurement activities, essentially the movement of the oil tankers. So it's being done already. There are satellites, surveillance planes, ships, tracking the movement of these tankers. After all, we are only talking about the East China Sea. North Korean oil tankers are very small. They don't go that far. But then I think a much more tantalizing prospect, given the involvement of the Treasury Department as well as the U.S. government at large, is targeting of the financial system. So at the end of the day, when North Korea buys petroleum products, they have to pay for it. So there's a movement of money taking place, and he has to rely on the financial system, whether that's China or somewhere else, but then likely it's going to involve US dollars, which makes these kind of activities under the purview of the US Treasury Department. And they have monitoring systems, there are banks, financial institutions around the world, they are required to comply with the regulation that with money laundering and illicit behaviors. So they report all this information back to the US government. So there's a very it's not easy still, but then there's straightforward ways for the U.S. government to monitor this kind of activities. So at the end of the day, I think that's what the South Korean government and the U.S. government are going to work together. So the role here for the South Korean government, given that the South Korean government doesn't have this global reach, will be the political side of it. So South Korea will be very active in issuing, as you said, unilateral sanctions now. So this is important because the players that are involved in the North Korea's illicit activities are likely to be either Chinese or Russian, are also likely to be involved in trade with not with North Korea but with South Korea as well. So in that sense, South Korean government will have a lot of leverages to be used to pressure these Chinese and Russian actors that are abetting North Korea's illicit behavior. So I think if South Korea, which is a major economic powerhouse in this part of the world, involves itself actively in sanctioning entities elsewhere that are helping North Korea to evade sanctions, I think that it's going to have a very significant impact, not just on Chinese and Russian actors, but also on North Korea proper.
So South Korea has a lot more leverage to place greater pressure on involved parties. Now, Shreyas, South Korea has recently heightened its anti-terrorism alert in its diplomatic missions in 5 countries, and this after gathering intelligence that North Korea may carry out a terrorist attack against South Korean diplomats. What's behind this? How do you see this?
Well, in this case, perhaps it's rather than more concrete information about terrorism, in some ways it's perhaps a little more reflective of the current inter-Korean tensions and the current mood between the two Koreas, particularly since North Korea declared unification impossible, revamped its inter-Korean policies, and also last year suspended the comprehensive military agreement between the two countries. I think we've seen tensions on the rise for a while, and amid that backdrop, there's this concern. What if North Korea carries out a terrorist attack? There have certainly been times in the past where North Korea has attacked targets, South Korean as well as others, Kim Jong-nam, famously Kim Jong-un's brother, on other countries' territory, and of course, former President Han Da-eun in Myanmar. So it's one of those things where you'd say there's precedent. South Korea is perhaps playing, says, better safe than sorry. But at the same time, it should perhaps be noted that this assessment was based on raising of threat levels based on the intelligence assessment that North Korea, amid an increasing number of elite-level defections, could perhaps look to deflect the blame, say South Korea is responsible for this, and so we should retaliate. And that's something that perhaps we haven't seen the actual evidence for this. Obviously, that's up to the intelligence authorities. So it may be concrete, it may not be, but at first glance, it does seem perhaps a little speculative and may not necessarily suit North Korea's immediate strategic needs. Also, I think from North Korea's perspective, or rather from the countries these are based in, while they have close relations with North Korea, for all of them, or at least most of them, they would also not have any interest in seeing a terrorist attack carried out on their soil by a third country. And they also have relations with South Korea. So for them, this would be a problem. They would certainly not want to avoid such a situation. So perhaps it's unlikely now, but I think from South Korea's perspective, like I said, it's playing it safe.
And the key points that you listed are being echoed by many experts here in South Korea as well. And this marks the first time first North Korea terror alert on overseas missions in 14 years since the torpedo attack on the warship Cheonan. Yeah. So, and not only diplomats, but Korean residents living in those countries are also advised to exercise caution for the time being. And staying with you, North Korea's external economic relations minister has expressed intent for his to boost cooperation with an Iranian automaker, Saipa, during his rare trip to Tehran. What are the implications of this and also of North Korean delegation's recent visit to Iran?
Yeah, I think as with a lot of, with the previous question, a lot of this could be down to what is the reality of it versus what is the perception of it. And certainly in this case, it could potentially have serious implications. North Korea growing closer to Iran, they already have close relations, but for the relations, there's talk of military cooperation, even though Iran has denied it. Certainly, that's always a concern. Now, in the case of this delegation, the focus was on the economy, but at the same time, you never know as the relations strengthen what they could lead to. In terms of the actual automotive cooperation here, now there are questions about that in terms of, under UN sanctions, technological cooperation is with North Korea is prohibited, at least, especially in cases where, for example, North Korea could learn advanced manufacturing processes, maybe have technology transfer. Also, where the cars going after this, are they likely to go to North Korea? Those are also, North Korea is not, other countries aren't allowed to sell or transfer vehicles to North Korea. So the question is, why would this happen? Why isn't Iran going to do it? Sure. Both countries could perhaps stand to gain from sanctions, but from evading sanctions. But it seems there are big questions about how this would work. So I think at this point we could also have to consider that this information essentially came from the minister visiting a trade expo in Iran, visiting the stall of this car maker, and then they said this on their social media account. It might just be blatant self-promotion. Certainly that's what one would hope. But obviously, bigger picture, still need to keep an eye on North Korea-Iran cooperation. They have a lot of close interests. They have mutual allies. So you never know what will happen next.
Meanwhile, Dr. Go, Seoul and South Korea and China are reportedly in final stage of their talks on Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol's visit to Beijing. What will be the main focus of his visit, and do you expect the two countries to improve soured relations?
Well, this is clearly a very positive sign, positive step. But then what's remarkable about it is that this is taking place without South Korea making or conceding to China with a policy change. The reason why the two countries didn't get along in the last 3 years was because South Korea, with the inauguration of the President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration, had made it very clear that South Korea was strongly allied with the United States, and also it was no longer willing to play the fence sitter between China and the United States, with these two major powers that are engaged in essentially a global competition. And the Chinese thought that by keeping its distance from South Korea would eventually turn around and try to approach Beijing in a more positive attitude from their point of view. But now the Chinese government is actually resuming high-level contacts without South Korean government having changed such a policy. So in that sense, it's a major achievement on the part of the President Yoon Suk-yeol's policy of strategic clarity. And I think this is going to pave the way for the realization of the three-way summit, the East Asian Summit, with the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, as well as the Chinese Premier Li Chang. They are going to come together and have a meeting, and this is going to signal to the wider international community that there's stability among the three East Asian countries, and the Chinese have a lot of incentives to do so because they need to stabilize their foreign relations right now because they are facing domestic troubles, especially the economic challenges that they're facing at home. So they have to make sure that they have good relations with both Korea and Japan. So in that sense, I think this has been a very positive outcome. South Korea didn't have to change its external policies to be in sync with the Chinese interest, and China has accepted South Korea as an important ally of the United States without any expectation that South Korea will distance itself from Washington.
And the final question is also for you. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Europe for his three-nation tour. This marks the first time he's visiting the continent in 5 years. What are the key points that South Korea should keep close tabs on? So clearly, the Chinese President Xi is in Europe, in France, having three-way meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, as well as the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And this three-way meeting is taking place because the European interests are aligned with the Chinese interests in the sense that they want to preserve the existing free trade order. They see over the horizon threat to this trade order in the form of the potential return of the former U.S. President Donald Trump to the White House. So they want to ensure that this free trade order remains, even if there are political changes taking place in Washington. But then there are sticking points out there. China is not exactly a fair competitor when it comes to free trade. So, for instance, the major issue here is the EV trade. I mean, the batteries. The batteries that go into electric vehicles. And the Chinese are dumping these batteries at the below market price in the world market, and the global automakers are suffering from it. So the French have asked the Chinese to address this issue, which the Chinese government didn't recognize anyway. So that's going to be a contentious point going forward. But then I think there are common interests here, mainly about the stability in the international community. We're talking about the war in Ukraine. And I think the Europeans are going to ask the Chinese to have a much more of an active role in brokering peace between Ukraine and Russia. And in that sense, China has an interest in both sides in this case. So it could be that with Chinese active involvement, we'll have maybe a peace on our hands soon. So I think these are the two issues that South Korea should be watching out for. Potential changes in the trade order, or maybe not the change, but the preservation of the existing trade order, as well as the end game happening in the war in Ukraine. All right, we'll leave it there tonight. Thank you, Dr. Go, as always, and Shreyas for your valuable insights. Great analysis. Thanks to both of you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time tomorrow.